and I'm with the University of Utah MEP Center. Thanks so much for joining us today. Our webinar topic is on manufacturing money, finding grants for your business to improve your bottom line. Our guest presenter today is Micki Vandeloo from Lakeview Consulting, and she'll be our presenter. Before we get started, as mentioned before, just make sure all your microphones are muted so we don't have noise interruptions. We'll also take questions at the end, and we'll have you enter your questions in the chat box. Micki, can you turn to the other slide?
Do you see my manufacturing money slide?
Yep, we just need the second one now.
Okay, right there.
Perfect. So Micki has had over 25 years in manufacturing, and she's helped her clients acquire over 20 million in grants for less than a $200,000 investment. And you can see her areas of investment, capital and training and continuation of services. And with that, I will turn the time over to Micki.
Thank you, Maureen, and I am so glad to be presenting this webinar for the Utah MEP. That's a great organization, fairly new, I believe, to the MEP system, but I think you guys are doing great work out there in Utah, and someday maybe we'll meet in person. Okay, so this manufacturing money webinar, as Maureen very accurately said, I have over 25 years in the manufacturing space, and my company currently actually works with a large number of diverse types of clients. I have 3 grant professionals on my staff, and me and my team actually have gotten over $100 million in grant funding for a variety of clients. But what I'm here to talk to you about today is to actually promote awareness of incentives available to manufacturers. And that's where my company started. I started with just writing for the manufacturing sector. And now we've expanded, but I do this manufacturing money webinar all over the country to help manufacturers understand incentives. Let's get started. So at Lakeview Consulting, our mission is to fund success. And as I said before, some of the communities we serve are manufacturing, education, R&D, civic organizations. We also do legal and healthcare. So we are very successful at what we do. We have about an 80% success rate, which is higher than the industry average. So we are good at what we do, but let's just talk about manufacturers and funding, because this is an area that I have a particular expertise in. I'm known throughout the country as the quote-unquote for-profit grant writing person. So I can tell you that in my Grant Professionals Association, there are very few of us. There's almost none of my type of grant writers, but I believe it's an area that is very underserved, and my goal is to help raise awareness, like I said before. So first, we're going to talk about why manufacturers need funding. You know, you as a manufacturer might be sitting there saying at your desk, maybe you're eating your lunch and watching this webinar and going, I don't know if I really want to do that. Well, I can tell you that manufacturers, there are a couple of benefits, and one of them is right here. It helps grant funding helps manufacturers improve their bottom line, and that's very obvious. So if, for example, you want to invest $500,000 in a piece of equipment and you get a grant for $250,000, it doesn't take too long to do the math to realize that your ROI just doubled for that piece of equipment. So it's going to take you half the time to pay off that equipment, assuming everything else remains equal. So it does help increase return on investment. In addition, many manufacturers, although many of them don't know it, actually can also help reduce their tax liabilities by getting tax credits. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the presentation. And finally, we can reduce that bottom line by reducing those training, research and development, capital expenses. So the expense line on your income sheet is the bottom of the income sheet. If you were going to project $11,000 in training and you got a grant for half of that, that reduces those expenses, again, increasing your bottom line profit. But the other area that is very important as to why manufacturers need funding is to help grow the economy. And I can tell you that in the millions of dollars I've gotten in the manufacturing community, every grant that I've gotten has either created jobs, created capital investment, increased the economic tax base in an area, increase services to manufacturers. So there's so many benefits beyond the financial benefits. So keep that in mind when you're trying to decide whether or not you need funding. Grant funding results in very worthwhile economic outcomes. But I've also found that many manufacturers don't pursue funding. And why don't they? So this is my take. This is why I believe this is the case. First and foremost, many manufacturers don't know about grant funding. When I go into a manufacturer and I start talking to them about grant funding, their eyes, it's like a deer in the headlights looks. They don't really know what grant funding is. They understand it from the perspective of not nonprofits. Many manufacturing leaders are involved in the community, and maybe they are involved with a nonprofit in their community. They might even be on the board of a nonprofit. So they've probably frequently heard that nonprofits are frequent recipients of grant funding. However, many manufacturers really don't think that it applies to them. They don't think that they can really get that funding, so they don't know about it. They also think if they do know about it or they've seen a grant application, it can seem very intimidating. Many times the grant application itself is 10 to 15 pages long, even longer sometimes if it's a federal grant. It can just seem really intimidating to complete the application and get all the documentation together, and you look at the requirements and you just look at it and say, I just don't think I can do it. I mean, I don't have the time. You know, that's a huge issue with many manufacturing leaders. Many of them tell me, I don't have the time to do this, which is why my organization exists, because we can actually break down that application process and make it seem much less intimidating and much easier to handle. The third reason why manufacturers don't pursue funding is misconceptions. So a lot of this came out of the handouts that went to the big three automotive companies back in 2008, 2009. And when that happened, a lot of, particularly those people in the manufacturing community, looked at that and said, well, the government's just giving out money and there's no real return to it. I mean, these companies are still in large part bankrupt. I think Ford came out of it before anybody else did. But, you know, it's not helping anything. It's not really doing anything. So a lot of people got a very sour taste in their mouth in the manufacturing community about grants. And then most recently, something that's been highly promoted on social media, a company called Foxconn, which is a foreign company, decided to put a large facility, very large facility, in Wisconsin. And in order to incentivize that move, the state of Wisconsin provided a large amount of incentive money for Foxconn. And immediately, things went out over social media saying, did Foxconn get too much? What are we really going to get out of this? What's really going to happen out of all this? And I can tell you, after years of working with economic development grants, if a company like a Foxconn or any other large company gets a large incentive, very, very likely there is either a job creation component or a capital investment component that is also very major, that is tied to that grant funding. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail later in the presentation, but be assured that the return, the economic return for that money is very significant. And anytime you get grant funding, there's going to be an outcome that will come about that will provide return on investment to the funder, whether it be in an increased tax base, increased jobs, some economic development mission. And then finally, some manufacturers know a lot about grant funding. They've either gotten grants or they've known companies that have gotten grants, but they just aren't interested. And this to me is probably the second best outcome from me talking to a grant funder. Talking to a manufacturer. When I talk to a manufacturing leader about grant funding and they listen to me talk about it and they say, you know, that's all really nice, but I just don't think we want to do it. I don't want to go there. Maybe they don't want to share their financials. Maybe they don't want to meet the terms of the grant agreement. Maybe they just don't think it's a good fit, but they just aren't interested. And I'm good with that because knowledge is power. That's why I do this webinar, is because my mission is to go out and inform as many manufacturers as I can about grant funding. Then they can choose whether or not to do it. Then it's their choice, and knowledge is power. So now we're going to talk about what funding is available for manufacturers. And I can tell you this is by far not an exhaustive list, but it is the most commonly used funding mechanisms for manufacturers besides loans and traditional sources of financing. So we have grants, we have tax credits, and we have the local government incentives. Again, not an exhaustive list, but for the purposes of keeping this to less than an hour and actually less than a day, there's no way we could talk about everything that's available to manufacturers. So this is the area that I specialize in. So what is a grant? Well, a grant is funding to offset costs of equipment, training, research, and development. So basically, a grant pays for a project that meets an outcome for which the funder wants to see an outcome result. So an outcome is what's going to change as a result of a project. So if you are doing a project and it's aligned with the funder's outcome, those are the times when grants are received by manufacturers. A grant does not have to be repaid, which makes it different than a loan or angel investing or in an indirect way, venture capital, because venture capital takes usually a portion of the company. There's no repayment. There's no ownership in the company by the grant funder. It is strictly a check that is issued to a company, and they can use it for the purposes outlined in their grant application. Most importantly, a grant is an agreement, and it's a legally binding agreement between the funder and the recipient. So if you are the recipient of a grant the first thing that will happen is you will get sent an agreement of some sort by the funder. Sometimes when you fill out an application and you sign the application, that automatically constitutes that agreement should you get the grant. And that will be very clearly stated in the application if that's the case. But most often there's a separate document. That document will say XYZ company agrees to purchase X amount of equipment, train X number of people, implement or build X building, X size building under this grant agreement. And in return for doing these activities, the grant recipient will receive X amount of money. So that is what a grant is. It essentially boils down to a legal agreement between the funder and the recipient. So I have found the best way to tell people about what can be funded through a grant is to give you some examples. So I'm going to talk about some common funder outcomes for manufacturing grants and also give you some examples. So the first one I want to talk about is reduced greenhouse gases. And this is a very popular one because the environmental results and the environmental outcomes are so great. So reduced greenhouse gases would be reducing diesel fuel usage. So one eligible project to reduce greenhouse gases might be the purchase of an electric powered truck. And these have been in the news again real recently because the folks at Tesla have actually just come out with a new tractor trailer that can go for 500 miles on a charge, which is absolutely incredible. Also, a new type of building material. So I actually work with a company that is developing a new type of building material that encapsulates greenhouse gases and keeps them from being released to the environment. It effectively stores the greenhouse gases. So you can either take the approach that you're going to not use the amount of diesel fuel, so you're going to avoid using that material that produces greenhouse gases, or you can store or encapsulate those greenhouse gases and keep them from being put out into the environment. So the next one related to recycling is reduced landfill disposal. So I was just talking to a company the other day, and one of their technology is actually going to be reducing landfill disposal because of, and it's a proprietary technology, but basically they are going to be doing a new technology, a new type of technology that's going to keep material out of the landfills. I helped a company get a $250,000 grant in the Kansas City area for a recycling piece of equipment. So they actually did recycling. They were a recycling company, and they recycled plastic bottles. So I helped them get a grant for a new piece of equipment that not only increased the amount of bottles they could recycle, but also made the recycled material cleaner at the end, so more of it could be used, and then even less then could go to the landfills. So this could be also recycling containers. So if you're undergoing a very large recycling project, or if you're a recycling company that sends out containers, the cost of those containers might be able to be offset by a grant. These are very commonly state grants. So these would be state economic development grants. So then the next funder outcome is support for a new market. So the story I have surrounding this is I actually worked for a company that was a steel service center. And if you don't know what those are, they take the very large coils of steel from the mill and they clean them and they slit them to size for stamping operations to certain widths. And also the one that I worked for cut those cut that coiled steel into sheets. So those sheets could be used for stamping or lasering operations. So the company that I worked for, and this was back in the 2008 timeframe when the economy was, we were going through the Great Recession, and the government put out what they called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funding. And that funding actually flowed to each of the states, and the states, based on their energy plan, helped promote a certain industry that would be related to their energy plan. So in Illinois, they were very focused on the wind energy industry. So the company that I worked for, I did a little bit of research and I found out that there was a lot of steel that was used in wind turbines. And a lot of it was a little heavier gauge than what we could process through our equipment. So I actually wrote a grant for $600,000 to get a more heavy gauge cut to length line. Long story short, that was a 2-year grant. So we started off with a $600,000 grant. Again, during that time frame, a lot of companies went out of business. So many companies turned back their grant money. But because we did a really good job of managing our grant and communicating with our funder, we actually increased that grant to $2.3 million by the end of the 2 years. So that company was able to purchase $3 million of new equipment for about $700,000. They got a $2.3 million grant. So that was to help support their entry into a new market. And it not only helped them get into the wind energy industry, but it also helped them do more applicable projects in the automotive sector, for example. And the last, another funder outcome that I'm going to talk about, and this is a very common one with manufacturers, and even if manufacturers don't know about all these other types of funding opportunities, a lot of them know about training funding. So this is to help upskill your employees, possibly to avoid layoff. So teach your employees a new skill so that instead of having to lay them off in a downturn, you can use them in more than one area, or you can actually train new people through some of the funding opportunities. So for example, the workforce workforce investment boards is what they used to be called. Their WIOA offices now are one-stop offices. A lot of those have grant funding for on-the-job training, which will help offset the cost of wages for a new employee while they're being trained for so many months, or incumbent worker training, which helps companies be able to afford to train current workers or people that are currently employed on their production floor. And the final funder outcome I'm going to talk about is exporting product. So there are a couple different angles for this one as well. So one source of funding, and I'll talk about it in the next slide, but it's to help fund trade missions to foreign countries. So if you're looking at exporting product to Colombia, for example, and you know there's a trade mission going over there, this funding can help offset your travel costs for trade missions, or possibly interpreter services that you might need while you're on that trade mission. But another angle that that has to do with exports for manufacturing funding is through an organization called the Trade Adjustment and Assistance Centers, the TAC centers, and they are in different regions of the United States. Typically, a TAC center does 1 or 2, possibly 3 different states. They serve more than one state usually. That funding is actually used to help manufacturing companies in the United States mitigate the negative effect of trade on their industry. So there's a whole qualification process that the TAC group helps you through. They walk you through everything. Those services are free. They help you determine if you're qualified, and if you are qualified, you can get up to $150,000 in funding to fund outside services. So these would be perhaps a contractor's cost for a new addition, or a consultant's cost to come in and do lean manufacturing training. So that TAC funding is really great funding. It's a very flexible funding source, which usually there's very narrow eligible activities, and a very narrow set of eligible activities for funding. This one has a very wide set of eligible activities. So these are the general categories of manufacturing funding. So we talked a little bit about some of the funder outcomes, but let's talk about where you can find that funding. So the federal government funding, with the exception of SBIR and STTR funding, which is actually done, it's actually issued directly from the federal government to a small business. Most federal government funding, such as USDA funding, the ERA funding that I was talking about before, funding for special initiatives, typically runs through the states. So they will have a large set of grant funding, and then they will allocate it to each state. And so, for example, the USDA programs in each state are federally funded programs, and their funding, their grant funding, actually comes from the federal government. So a lot of times you won't see it as a Washington, D.C. based source of funding. You'll see it as your local USDA office, your TAC group. All that is federal funding that runs through the TAC centers. The one that is more applicable directly to manufacturing are the state government programs. So this could be training funding, this could be recycling programs. That STEP, or state trade and export promotion, that's the funding that goes to each state that applies for it, that can help companies offset the cost of trade missions. And again, some special initiatives. So if a state has the one that always comes to mind, and don't take this the wrong way, but I love wine, and so a lot of states have special funding to help fund, for example, the generation of wineries in their state. If they want to grow their perception as a wine making state, they might fund certain initiatives related to that, or related to tourism. So those would be under what I would call special initiatives. They would be just priorities set by the state for economic development. Another source of manufacturing funding is the workforce investment boards, and you can really, the easiest way to find out where your local one to do is, the local workforce investment board is to Google it, type it in, and put in your county or your state, and you can get a list of all the workforce investment board districts in your state. Again, these are also called WIOA, W-O-I-A boards. These are typically training funding, as I mentioned before. So on-the-job training for new employees, incumbent worker training for existing employees. And finally, one that a lot of manufacturers don't know about, even though a lot of you are involved in trade associations, a lot of times manufacturing-related trade associations come into grant funding through one form or another. They are technically 501c3s or 501c4s. And those are eligible for a much wider set of funding, than manufacturers are. So organizations like the Haas Foundation. The Haas Foundation actually supplies, not to manufacturers, but to manufacturing training programs. They supply machinery to those training programs, and they help build workforce industry training programs. About a year ago, NIMS, the NIMS organization, it's the National Manufacturing Standards Organization, they had a funding source to establish apprenticeships. So, and one I saw last week was an energy provider industry association actually had grant funding that they awarded to a local energy company to do workforce training in I think it was a 3-county area in one state. So those are related like trade associations, and a lot of times they might also have grant funding. So it's worth asking. So the next category of manufacturing funding that we're going to discuss is tax credits. So there's 3 primary sources of tax credits for manufacturers. We have the new market tax credits, We have research and development, or R&D tax credits, and also enterprise zone tax credits. And again, you might be in an enterprise zone and you don't even know it. And that's why I put this particular part of this webinar in here, because again, I want to tell you about things you might not know about, because I want you to know that they're out there. So new market tax credits are for companies in rural communities or economically distressed urban areas, places that typically manufacturers might not want to go, either because they're concerned about the workforce aptitude, or they're concerned about the location. So it's to stimulate that investment and economic growth in areas that are typically underserved by manufacturing. That tax credit is equal to 39% of a bank's funding over 7 years. So it's a long-term tax credit. It's over 7 years, 5% for the first 3 years, and 6% in years 4 through 7. Now, again, this not being my area of expertise, I have put, and you will get a copy of this presentation and a copy of this recording after. But I put at the bottom of all these slides some sort of web information to get the total story on these tax credits. So this one is from the New Market Tax Credit Coalition, nmtccoalition.org, and there's a fact sheet on there that you can get all the information on that. And so just a little bit more information. It does provide access also to capital for companies who, for some reason, whether it's that they're a startup or they had some financial problems, but they can't obtain financing from traditional banks. So this tax credit helps them do so. So the example that I give here is that you might borrow $100 or $1 million from a qualified and new market tax credit borrowing institution, or a CDE. You would get the tax credit equal, if you're approved, you would get the tax credit equal to 5% of $1 million for 3 years and 6% for 4 years. And what I often tell manufacturers is contact your local bank. That's a great starting point. If they are not a CDE, most often they do know who the CDE is in that area, and they can help you. Also, organizations, professional accounting firms like Clifton Larson Allen have people on staff that can help you not only identify if you qualify for new market tax credits, but can help you with the application process. And that can be fairly lengthy, that application process. So now I'm going to the one, this tax credit program is probably the worst named tax credit program out there, the research and development tax credits. And more manufacturing companies I'm finding are learning about these research and development tax credits. But they do fund more than just research and development. They are tax credits that are a dollar for dollar reduction against taxes currently owed or previously paid. So you can look back up to 3 years prior for qualifying expenses, which is very unusual in either the grant or tax credit world. But this is a great program. Every successful company can really apply for R&D tax credits. The one organization that I give in this presentation is the Blackline Group. They are a group that does solely R&D tax credits, but there's also a group called Smart Tax Pro. It's Sean Merchant is the person's name that runs that company, and they also are experts in R&D tax credits, and they've helped a number of Utah companies get those tax credits. So if you want to email the Utah MEP, I'm sure they can get you in contact with Sean and his company to see if you guys do qualify. I think it's always worth looking to see if you qualify, to see if this is a program that would be a good fit for you. So eligible projects must pass a 4-part test. And you see the 4 parts there. I'm not going to read them to you, but Scott Schmidt of the Blackline Group is who I have seen present on this topic, and he's very knowledgeable. And again, if you want to know about Smart Tax Pro, let the Utah MEP know, and I know they have his contact information. The final one is enterprise zone tax credits. And again, you might be in an enterprise zone and you might not really know that you are. And I encourage companies to see if they are, because if your company is located in an enterprise zone, which most industrial parks have been designated enterprise zones, and that designation is from a county entity. So counties actually approve enterprise zones. I guess technically states approve enterprise zones in counties, but the counties administer that enterprise zone program. There's usually somebody in the county that is responsible for that, or at the state level. But tax and sales credits can be available to offset purchases when you want to expand, when you want to relocate, if you want to locate to an enterprise zone. There can be a significant number of tax and sales credits. Every state is different on these enterprise zone tax credits, and some of them call them enhanced enterprise zones, or there's other names for them. This is a significant benefit if you are looking, especially if you're looking to locate to a new state. I highly recommend you check to see where the enterprise zones are and see if a location might be a good fit. One of those locations might be a good fit for your manufacturing facility or your distribution facility. So some local government incentives, TIF financing. If you're located in a TIF district, now this is a process. So if you're located in a TIF district and you're looking to expand your manufacturing operation, the first thing you have to do is you have to get an assessment of your existing manufacturing operation before you ever start digging the footings for the new building. Before you ever do any work, you need to get that baseline assessment, and then you need to apply for TIF financing. You cannot start any work that you want to have be applicable to that TIF application. You can't start any of that work until that application is approved. And sometimes that takes 2 to 3 months because of all the approvals that are required. So the lesson here is don't wait until right before you start doing something to look for a grant or an incentive, because to get a grant takes time, to get incentives take time just from an approval standpoint. Even if the application is very simple, sometimes those approval entities only meet once every month or once every 2 months. So that will lengthen the amount of time until you can start your project. So keep that in mind if you're looking at I know a lot of companies right now are in budgeting cycles for next year. Now is the time to look to see if you can get grants and incentives, not when you start doing the work, because then you often miss out on available grants and incentives. So the TIF financing is good. Basically, what that TIF financing does is once you get that baseline assessment, then you get your facility assessed after you get the work done, and the difference in that assessment can be returned to you in the form of grants to do other projects at your facility. And another local government incentive is the community development block grants. Now, these are most likely going to be in the very distressed communities, maybe in an urban area, but sometimes they're also in rural areas, areas that are high unemployment rates, that have high unemployment rates. Sometimes those types of communities can apply for community development block grants. So those are awarded to communities. And then the communities in turn award money through that grant to businesses or nonprofits that do work in their community that fits their community development plan. So a community development plan is in the application, and then if you are doing a project that enhances achievement of that plan, then you can get a community development block grant. So your municipality is the best source for information on this. You basically would contact your mayor or the mayor's office or your city's economic development office and find out if your area, the area that your manufacturing facility in, can be the recipient of a community development block grant, or CDBG, you hear these called. So how do you access the money? And this might be why a lot of you are on this call. Maybe you know that there is funding out there, but how in the world do you get it? So it's really a simple process that is a lot more complex when you get into the details. But in regards for the time, then I think we're just going to go through these 4 steps very simply. So one is to define the project, and this is the most important part of the grant funding process. You need to identify what resources you're going to need to do your project, what kind of outcome you want to get from your project. So I'll use an example. So let's say you want to do a building addition that's going to result in hiring 5 new people and investing in some equipment and investing in some lighting and fixtures and HVAC. So you kind of have a broad idea of what your project is. What I encourage clients to do is actually dig deeper and say, okay, what resources am I going to need to complete this project? Am I going to need to hire a construction company? Am I going to need to put some engineering staff that I have on this project? especially for speccing out new equipment? Am I going to have any consultants that I need to bring in to help design the building, or an architectural firm? What costs am I going to have? All those are resources. People, money, those are all resources. What activities then are those people going to do? What specific activities are they going to do? The engineers are going to spec out equipment. They're going to competitively bid equipment. They're going to purchase equipment. Those are activities. And then what you want to see at the end of the day is that your activities and your resources, when applied, get you to whatever outcome you want. So maybe it is increased capacity to serve your current clients, or maybe it's to enter a new market. So you know that there's a new market out there, and you know if you do this project, you're going to be able to enter that new market. So whatever outcome it is that you want to see, define your project to make sure you're going to meet that outcome. And if you can't through what you're doing, then you need to go back and look at your resources, see what you need to do, what kind of activities you have to have, what kind of resources to get you to your outcome. That is a standalone project that our group does with companies a lot, which is called a logic model. So working through defining that project. The reason why it's so important to define your project is so you can accurately know your outcomes, and then you can go look for funding, which is the research step. So the next step after you define your project is to do the grant research. Then after you do the research, you can apply for the funding. And then finally, once you apply, and if you get grant funding, you're going to have to report. So, and then you do it all over again with your next project or with another part of that project. More often than not, when I see a client with one project, there could be 2, maybe 4 or 5 different sources of potential funding for that project, but maybe one will pay for the equipment, and one will pay for the training, and one will pay for the building. So a lot of times defining that project is very important, but you might do that cycle over and over again with different parts of that project once you define it. So I wanted to give some tips for a successful funding acquisition process, because I think it's good to know what you need to do and what are best practices. And these are definitely best practices that I've found over the years of writing grants for manufacturers. First, I tell companies to keep their eyes and ears open. And this means when you go to a trade association meeting, when you go to a chamber meeting, listen and listen to see if anybody's talking about available grant funding or grant funding they've received. Keep your eyes open in social media. You can possibly see that the state has a new grant program out. I know I'm a big fan of LinkedIn. I do a lot of work on LinkedIn articles and posts and stuff. And a lot of times when a state has a new funding program, they'll announce it, and they'll have a link to the application on LinkedIn. So make sure that you're connected to your state economic development agency on your social media channels, and keep your eyes and ears open. Show off your facility. Now, we just got through with manufacturing day, and that's a 1 day or a 1 week, or sometimes in best cases, a 1 month event in a state. And that's one opportunity. That's an opportunity to take students and teachers and parents and counselors through your facility. But I'm talking about opening up your facility to government officials, opening up your facility to city and county legislators. So maybe your county board or your mayor's office or a group from your mayor's office, your alderman, people out in the community, just a general open house plant tour. I know a lot of companies do this, but the reason why this helps so much, particularly with government officials, is that a lot of them don't know what you do on a day-to-day basis. Unless you frequently have them through your facility, or they had some hand in helping you with your facility, in which case, if your facility has been around for longer than 4 to 8 years, then they probably didn't have a hand in it, because it's probably somebody else in that position. I've actually taken governors through manufacturing facilities. I've taken state treasurers through manufacturing facilities, and they're amazed with what manufacturers do in their state, and they're interested. So show off your facility, and when the next funding opportunity comes along, their staff might remember that you exist, and that might help you get a grant when you might not have known about that grant before. Also check emails, newsletters from trade associations. Those can be good sources for available grants. And again, define your project before you look for grants. Don't just go and look for a grant and say, okay, now we're going to do something to achieve this grant. If there's a training grant out there, don't invent training just to get the grant. That's not the right way to do it. You need to have a training plan in place, and then when the training grant funding comes, then you can access that training grant. So define your project, put your plan together before you ever look for a grant. Also, you can do your own search regularly or hire it out. Grant funding changes all the time. With every new administration, with every new governor, with every new president, there's different priorities. There's a big push right now for workforce training that manufacturers are going to indirectly benefit from or even directly benefit from. So a lot of apprenticeship programs out there right now, but those weren't out there a year ago. So you either need to do your own search regularly or you need to hire it out. So our organization actually does grant research for manufacturing firms, and I'd be more than happy to talk to you about that process. If you do find a grant, and this is not just for my firm, consider hiring somebody to write the grant. And the reason why I say this is many companies think that it's not much harder than writing a letter. And I'm here to tell you that grant applications and grant proposals can be extremely complex. And you have to dot your I's, cross your T's, put the required documentation in the grant application. A lot of times it's an online application, which can have its own set of challenges. And grant consultants can walk you through the process. They can make the process so much more manageable. And that's what I'm proud of at my company, is that my clients at the end of the day almost always say, this was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. This is much less work. It didn't take us nearly as much effort. So that alone is worth the cost of doing that consulting with the client a lot of times. But again, I have the ROI for our services at Lakeview Consulting. And again, ask your potential grant consultant what their ROI is. Ours is about $100. It's over $100 actually for every dollar that our clients spend on us. So for each dollar that you spend, you can expect to get on average $100 back for that, whether it's through a grant research project that identifies available grants for you, or whether it's through a grant writing project. And finally, this is kind of the golden rule of grant funding. Say what you do in your application, but then do what you say. So if you say you're going to hire 5 people in the next 2 years in your grant application, the funding is contingent upon you hiring 5 people. So if you hire 3 people, technically the funder has the right to come back and prorate your grant based on those reduced outcomes. So what I always tell people is be conservative. If you think you might hire 5, but you know you're going to hire 3, say 3. If you overhire, that doesn't hurt you, but it really could hurt you if you don't meet your outcomes that you say you're going to meet. And again, there are things you can do in the management process and with communication with the funder that can help mitigate that if something does happen, but that's all part of that management process. That's all part of that communication with the funder that's so very important. So to recap, I know that right now people's budgets are getting formed. So if your company's, I should say your company's budget, if your company's budget includes any of the following projects, in this case, contact the University of Utah MEP and they will get you in touch with me to find out if grant funding or incentives are available. So if you're looking at employee training, some sort of capital investment, maybe a new building, maybe some research and development activity or recycling or any other type of program that you think might be eligible, we can do a grant research project. So here's a listing of my company's services. So we do that project definition. That project definition is so very important. And we do needs assessments, so that can help you determine the need for a new service or the need for a certain workforce training program, maybe to get the details of what industry needs in your area. The logic model is a tool that I was talking about that helps you define a project in a very detailed manner. We do a lot of grant and incentive research, and a lot of times that's from companies that are looking to relocate. So for example, a manufacturer might call me and say, I'm looking at 2 different locations, one in Butler County, Indiana, and one in Clinton County, Illinois. Please look up the incentives and all the available grants and funding available to me to help me make a more informed decision on where to go. And I can tell you that I've done these types of research, and every state and county is vastly different all over the United States. And it's a maze trying to get through all of those. So we just did one of these research projects for a company that was moving into a new facility. And we identified, I believe, 15 different sets of grants and incentives that either could immediately be applied for or could down the road, or when they get more mature at their new location. And that company is currently looking into those funding opportunities. We do grant writing. We also do proposal reviews. So if you do your own grant writing, if you have somebody on staff that happens to have the expertise, but you want an extra set of eyes, we can do that. And finally, through grant funding efforts, I work with a lot of leaders and have found that a lot of them are very overwhelmed. So I have a lot of experience coaching, and I do executive and leadership coaching to help reduce that overwhelm a little bit and help give you an accountability partner and help you reach your goals, because I know a lot of times they seem way out there and very unmanageable. So now we will take questions from the chat box.